Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 8th of August 2022. I am joined as ever by my really rather hot co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. Hot in more ways than one, it has to be said.
Most people I know would disagree with that completely, but anyway, that's
Well, that's true. That's true. You do have very good air conditioning, so
come on, Mark, you visited our house. Air conditioning is sort of some louvered windows and some curtains.
well, okay. Whether it's a subjective opinion or an objective fact, with regards to how hot Andy is, my and our watching brief continue. Our weekly mission to bring you the archaeological news of the week and also news which is relevant to archaeology. And this week really fits into that category because we're going to be looking at the last two candidates in the running to be Britain's next Prime Minister. And the reason why this is important for archaeology is because of what they've been talking about recently. It's indirect, and they may not even know that what they're saying has bearing on archaeology and heritage, but it does. This was really kicked off last weekend with Rishi Sunak, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, saying that he vows to end low-earning degrees in post-16, so post-16 years old, education shake-up in the UK. So that's sort of that'd be England and Wales rather, not the UK. Candidate for Prime Minister proposes to raise prestige of vocational education and mandate sixth form maths and English with a British baccalaureate. And basically wants to have a review of degrees and their pay outcome, their value outcome in terms of earning potential. And to discourage Russell Group universities from teaching low-value prospect degrees. And, Andy, I do believe that archaeology is a low-value prospect degree, isn't it?
It is and it isn't, according to the data and according to the government. Look, this is a trope in conservative politics that goes right the way back to certainly as long as for my entire adult life since the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Conservatives have some conservatives have argued that basically higher education, further education should be more transactional. It should be more it should be focused on things that are, quotes, valuable to the economy.
Yeah, yeah.
And
so in that sense, the state invests in you with a view to you paying back and more in terms of your tax yield.
Precisely that.
Yeah.
Precisely that.
Mm-hmm.
And the current debate really began in January 2021, when the then Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, Russia should shut up and go away. And he set out rejig priorities for government funding for higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, the what's called the high cost subject funding. And in a paragraph headed high cost subject funding supporting strategically important subjects, Williamson said high cost subject funding is currently allocated simply based on the higher costs of provision with little strategic prioritization. The Office for Students should reprioritise funding towards the provision of high-cost, high-value subjects that support the NHS and wider healthcare policy, high-cost STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths, and or, quote, specific labour market needs.
Yeah.
And that included subjects like medicine, veterinary science, dentistry, shortage areas at the moment, nursing, anatomy and physiology, science, including agriculture, forestry, earth, marine and environmental science, biosciences, chemistry, physics, engineering and information technology. Subjects that are high cost that would be cut included things like music, performing arts, art, basically the creative humanities.
Yeah.
Archaeology was also initially included in the cut, but later on in July, after a lobbying and reconsideration by the department, archaeology was removed from that list. So archaeology at the moment retains its higher cost subject funding. Although how long that remains the case, we can have a discussion about probably.
Yeah.
So Sunak wasn't talking in a vacuum. This is a debate that's been going on for some time. And in fact, the government had already moved towards the position that Sunak was talking about.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Except that I suppose in this instance, this is even less. This is more naked, more bold, more brash in terms of its focus on earning potential as opposed to strategic requirements. I mean, at one point, Williamson was even talking about universities regionally meeting regional economic requirements as well. I don't know
Yes.
where that is at the moment. Again, we're in an interim government right now, but this is important because it's a direction of travel that, as you say, has been established and doesn't seem to be going anywhere just yet. And so my immediate question upon hearing this was, well, how can the archaeological sector up the not only the perception but the real world value of getting an archaeology degree in that sense? What one of the easiest ways of doing that, one of the most straightforward ways of doing that, is to insist that archaeology is worth more, insist on greater pay. Yes, that would have an impact on development, and as we've seen in previous pay and rates statements, groups like CIFA are often anxious to insist on that themselves, and they leave it to individual units to negotiate with developers on how much they should pay archaeologists. Another way forward is to have a direct from high school recruitment drive within archaeology. In other words, get people on board who haven't got an undergraduate, so a postgraduate level education, and teach them the skills required for whatever job they're being hired for. So presumably that would be diggers, but that's also going to be interesting and problematic when you're having to deal with post-ex, for example, analysis of the output of a mass spectrometer, for example. This stuff requires university education, and indeed, archaeology, I do believe at the last count, is 96% plus a higher education or a postgraduate employer. Of course, the third option is, and I laid all of this out in a TikTok. Do follow me if you want to. The third option is potentially just to rely on lovely retirees and the expertise that is currently often found amongst volunteers, and have an ever shrinking number of actually trained archaeologists and expertise in an ever older group of people who simply oversee digs which are done by other people. And this is more or less a move back, a step or half a step back towards sort of noble amateurism in archaeology. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you've included a link here showing that it's not all necessarily bad. I mean, in that sense, we've both included links that sort of highlight that there's an acknowledgement of a need for practical skills in terms of training and other education prospects. But archaeology is awkward because it's not a skill like being a carpenter or a builder, but it's also not it's not an old-fashioned skill like being a lawyer or a doctor.
It's a difficult one, and it's one that we're talking about identity here,
Hmm.
and the identity of archaeology is something people have been wrestling with probably since the discipline was invented.
Hmm.
It was originally the realm of the gentleman amateur, the landowner who had an interest in the humps and bumps on his land and got his workers to go out and dig a barrow on a Sunday afternoon, and while he watched with his family and his friends and a picnic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it appeared as a woodcut, as a print or whatever in the Gentleman's Magazine or the Illustrated London News. And then you move into through the 19th century into the early 20th century, certainly academically archaeology professionalizes. To the extent by the 1930s, you've got somebody like Mortimer Wheeler who founds the Institute for Archaeology at UCL, having begun as working through museums and the Museum of London in its original incarnation, the Guildhall Museum. So, and it's only really since the 1970s that the modern sort of I say industrial archaeology, people get the wrong idea. The industrialization, the incorporation of archaeology into the development industry
Mm-hmm.
only really began to happen by accident from the 1950s onwards. You had rows like the Temple of Mithras, in the redevelopment of the City of London in the 1950s, led to a demand for the past to be recognised while reshaping the space that we live in for the present.
Yeah.
And you have the earliest of the regional units are founded in the 1970s, who negotiate access almost site by site with developers. I mean, I began my archaeology career in Canterbury with the Canterbury Archaeological Trust in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and pre-PPG, Policy Planning Guidance 16. And it was that coming at the end of the 1980s after the Rose Theatre controversy that really created modern developer-funded archaeology, which is where the bulk of professional archaeology happens these days. And it's those people that the Profile in the Profession report that you alluded to talks about, with the 96% plus graduate profession, but on starting wages that
are beaten by people who stack shelves in supermarkets.
Precisely. Yeah. And no other profession really would stand for that.
No.
Doctors certainly don't, although junior doctors aren't particularly highly paid for the hours they have to work and the responsibilities they carry, and the fact they're still training. And in fact, most archaeologists would argue they never stop training. They're always finding new things. Many people, even people with BAs who are maybe working on the digging circuit, are also fitting in possibly extra study to get to move into other areas, like you talked about. Finds is a really crucial area. Finds analysis is a really crucial area, and it's a problematic area because the first generation or so of finds specialists are starting to leave the profession through retirement.
Yes.
And there's a big question over who's going to replace them, because there is a huge reservoir of experience that's built up over 30, 40 years.
And also an awful lot of that experience is inside their heads.
Indeed.
And I don't mean that as a statement of the bleeding obvious. I mean that to say that there's very little, we've discussed this in previous watching briefs, also I've talked about this with interviews with other archaeologists, that there's very little at the moment reason for specialists to write down everything they know, because when they're working, it cuts back on their work because other people can benefit from their knowledge without having to hire them. And when they're not working, well, they're retired. They don't want to have to sit down and write down 6 volumes of a
And I think it's
work.
also, absolutely, I think it's also important to say a lot of find specialists are freelancers. So they're not actually in the office passing on their knowledge to, to the Jedi, to the Padawan, it's BB2 this is.
Yeah.
They're sat at home in their home offices with
BB8,
their microscopes,
surely.
and they.
Yeah, sorry.
We won't go down that particular road.
I've got one up there.
But no, look. No, the serious point is, a lot of them are working in a relatively solitary way, and there isn't the body of knowledge that's spread through the community. So that if you knock away one leg from the 4-legged table, the table might still stay up on the other 3 legs. It's not the case. You lose particularly an uber specialist area.
Yeah.
And the profession, if somebody leaves that particular specialism, then the profession is probably playing catch up for some time, or relying on written reports.
Yeah. One of the ironies here, one of the supreme ironies especially in the story that you just laid out, and this idea that in the 1950s, Temple of Mithras and a reaction to that reaction arguably, almost certainly, came from precisely the sort of people that these policies now are designed to appeal to. People who are somewhat comfortable, people who've taken interest in history and culture, for whom it is an important part of their time off, in a way that they would argue possibly it isn't for working class people. That isn't the case, but nonetheless we're talking about some stereotypes here, and also demographics and what they're trying to appeal to in terms of votes. And given that so many conservative base members, so we're talking sort of middle class for the most part people, love and benefit from a National Trust property or a historic landscape or so on and so forth in their leisure time, why is this such a go-to for campaigning? Why is it such, as we've seen in the past few weeks in recent watching briefs, why is it something that the press goes to bash academics, but also in particular for some reason archaeologists are seen as a soft touch for this? when these precisely the people who are going to be voting for them also love history. They love going and getting a nice cream scone at a big house somewhere.
I think there's a disconnect between the two factors. Now, again, just to put people in the picture, people who, and particularly people who are outside the UK, maybe who are watching this and aren't so familiar with the way British politics works. We don't have a presidential system in Britain, although the Prime Minister effectively, in some respects, has almost presidential powers these days, and certainly a presidential image these days. That's actually that's smoke and mirrors. That's been created by the media and by government, governing party,
and by
spin
ego
doctors
as well.
and by ego. Yeah. The British Prime Minister is the member of Parliament who can command a majority in Parliament. What's happened now is that Boris Johnson can no longer command a majority in Parliament because he doesn't have the confidence of the majority of the MPs in his party, the Conservative Party. He said he's going to resign. The Tory Party, Conservative Party, is having an election for its leader, and that leader, by default, becomes Prime Minister.
Yeah.
At the moment.
Yeah.
So
and that'll be happening. That'll be happening at the beginning of September. But
the result will be the campaign is happening now, which is why we're talking about it and why Sunak made his comments. He made his comments in a hustings, in a debate in front of, I think it was Conservative Party activists, in fact.
Yeah.
And the votes are happening at the moment. Individual votes are being cast at the moment, and the results are going to be announced at the beginning of September. And so the next Prime Minister will be either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, and they will become automatically both leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister, and they will have been elected by around about 180,000 people who the profiling suggests are largely older people, largely white, mostly male, and mostly living in the southern half of Britain. So you can see there's arguably a democratic deficit there already.
Yeah,
but that person will have been elected legitimately under the UK's current system. They will be Prime Minister and will have the ability to mould government.
So perhaps then an answer to my question, which I don't think you did answer, is to say that actually there's a feedback loop here. Archaeology, heritage, and aspects of higher education provides a good straw man that newspapers that these people will be reading can punch around in order to look as though something is being done and something needs to happen in order to vote for someone in order to do that thing, which ultimately, as far as they're concerned, is a relatively low risk prospect. They don't think that actually punching an archaeologist, metaphorically speaking, is a big problem, but it's a big win in terms of votes.
I think it's more complex than that.
Okay.
I will answer your question.
I mean, that was quite a complicated little circle, but go ahead.
Yeah, look, no, I was trying to lay out some background. No, look, what I think is going on is you talked about National Trust properties and people enjoying going to National Trust properties and maybe buying memberships to English Heritage and enjoying visiting those kind of sites in their leisure time. People have been doing that for over a century now.
Yeah.
More so. I mean, if you remember in Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie Bennet visits the Darcy's family house almost as a tourist. They're given a guided tour.
Yeah, it was the thing, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, people would open up their homes.
That's right, exactly that.
Not to riffraff, though. Not to riffraff.
Oh no, but then you can argue
much like the National Trust, to be honest, these days. But anyway,
speaks an ex-employee of the National Trust. Look, no. So I think there's a disconnect between visiting those sites and how those sites being presented as beautiful examples of history and landscape and art and architecture, and the modern professional world of archaeology and history.
Those sites are understood as being static, aren't they? They're fixed. And in that sense, they're not politically active in the same way that an archaeologist might be perceived to be.
That's a way of putting it, certainly. And I think what we've seen in the last decade, in particular, with the rise of populism and the rise of a kind of right-wing populism, which is really nationalistic and libertarian, it is that the modern practice of presenting those sites, of researching their histories, of researching, for example, and this is where the National Trust has run into trouble with the right and the right of the media, researching links of significant, what used to be called stately homes, country estates, with funding provided, for example, by the exploitation of enslaved African people in the Caribbean to grow sugar. Or tobacco in the southern United States or whatever. Those things are seen as being somehow anti-history, anti-English actually, because this is very much, I think, driven by the London-based rights of
Well,
the media.
You described it yourself. These are people largely from the south of Britain, actually the south of England, and in that sense, it can be seen as so. Well, the thing is, I think for some people, it's actually seen as being accusatory. It's not so much as being. It's not just a fear of change or the perception of change around the story of their favourite local house, but the idea that somehow they're being told you are bad, you're a bad person because of
Yes.
this history that occurred.
In a sense, these kind of right-wing populist sentiments, again, they've been around for a long time. This is a quote from a Labour MP, a Labour Arts Minister, Culture Minister called Tony Banks, who was active in the early years of the Blair administration. He sadly died in office. But he was one of Parliament's most famous wits. And this is a quote about a particular Conservative MP called Terry Dix, who actually left Parliament in 1997. So this dates this kind of comment. But there's a kind of anti-art, anti-culture view in parts of the Tory party that's been there for a long time. And I think we see that still in these comments about worthless degrees and so on. This is what Banks said about Terry Dix. When he leaves the chamber, he probably goes to vandalise a few paintings somewhere. He is to the arts what Vlad the Impaler was to origami. He's undoubtedly living proof that a pig's bladder on a stick can be elected as a member of Parliament. Now, I can think of a few current members of Parliament that description could probably be applied to in the Conservative Party. And, so I think I don't think we should get too obsessed with the idea that this is some new struggle. It's not. It's been going on for a long time. As I said earlier, it's just something. It's just perhaps more advanced in terms of actual action now than it has been, and that's why it's a concern now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I don't think it's remotely new. What I do think is important, though, is to be prepared and to ask some questions of ourselves as a sector. Namely, what are we doing to combat this perception that archaeologists are wastrels, are not a proper science, not a money-earning science, and also as well are potentially even culturally subversive. And more to the point, what are we doing to raise the value of an archaeological degree? How can we do that? How should we do that? And especially given that these sort of vagaries, this sort of ephemeral distaste for these culturally active academic pursuits and scientific pursuits now can be objected to purely on the basis that it doesn't earn a lot of money. So that's a criteria that's very clear, and it's one that very clearly can be tackled. Rather than trying to make arguments about, oh, it's a lovely thing to do, archaeology, it's fantastic. Do that, but also meet them now on the playing field that they've laid out. Wages, for goodness sake.
Right, okay, I think there's a problem.
We're a graduate
here.
Profession.
Right, yeah. Look, there is a problem here, though, and that is how archaeologists relate to each other and to each other's roles. And to an extent, I feel as though I'm standing in the stable door watching the different horses of archaeology, watching their backsides disappearing over the hill in different directions. The horses are going to have to be rounded up and put back in the stable before, to at least most of them, before anything can really be done here. Because, for example, in terms of developer-funded archaeologists, I've heard developer-funded archaeologists some developer-funded archaeologists arguing that you don't need a degree to work on a developer-funded site on a Stonehenge tunnel or a
Yeah.
or an HS2.
Mm-hmm.
All you need are the technical skills to dig.
Yeah.
And that's how it's done in some parts of the world. It's how it's done in Belgium where I've done some work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have a workforce, and then you have the graduates who are actually directing the work and do the writing up.
Mm.
There is, however, the problem that you point out, which is, well, first of all, where's the career progression?
Yeah.
And secondly, where's arguably the balance, the range of knowledge you need to contextualize what you're doing? And you're basically, what you're talking about there is turning somebody from a thinking graduate capable of having a discussion with their boss about the meaning of what they're doing to somebody working on a production line doing one particular function day in, day out.
That's true, but
is
also
that the kind of archaeology that people want?
Well, but also as well, do we want the kind of archaeology where not only is the person not able to have a nuanced conversation with their boss, but they're not able to have a nuanced conversation with what's at the end of their trowel? People talk about archaeology at the trowel's edge all the time, and that's the thing. It's a skill. It's a sensation. It's a relationship with the soil. It's not just moving mass out of the ground. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, it should also be said that Liz Truss is thinking of monkeying with tinkering with the academic year. She suggested that universities should start their courses in January as opposed to September or October. So she's doing something on the side of universities, but we'll come back to her after this break, because she is going back to another Tory perennial, and that is planning.
But as is Sunak.
Actually, yes, a good point. Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to them both after the break. Here's a message from me. A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. It's interesting as well, before we move on to our next sort of chunk, that a lot of this is also in the reporting and how you talk about it. For example, the headline in the Metro is that Rishi Sunak is to crack down on degrees that don't make students lots of money. So if you put it that way, that sounds incontestably fantastic. So it is often about how you talk about this stuff, and this is one of the reasons I think why we're talking about it this week, is just to highlight that it may not at first glance seem as though this is archaeological news, but it absolutely is talking about the little space that archaeology occupies.
Absolutely, and I just make one point before we move on about money and about wages, because I didn't really address it in the first half of the show, and that is that, as we're seeing at the moment with the RMT, organisations, professions, in that case train drivers, skilled professions like train drivers, who have powerful representation from unions, have their employers take them seriously. The employers won't just roll over and give them money, but they get taken seriously, and they get larger pay rises and improvements on their pay and condions. They
also spark national debate and discussion. It becomes an unavoidable.
Precisely that. Now, the trade union movement is getting a higher penetration in archaeology currently, for reasons I think a lot to do with what we're discussing. People in the profession are not satisfied with their current lot, and they think more could be done, and they want more to be done. So Prospect are recruiting. Other trade unions, Unite, are also have representation within the archaeological profession. But there is no one union that has the majority of archaeologists, and archaeologists have certainly not been, for example, considering balloting for industrial action in certainly in my living memory.
No.
Certainly not on any scale. In spite of the constant complaints you hear about pay and conditions, and we had allegations, for example, about a unit behaving inappropriately during the last heat wave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Which we're currently
and
entering another one, aren't we? Potentially worse heat wave at the moment. Yeah.
and indeed, and stay safe out there, everybody. Make sure you know your rights, and you know how to protect yourself and your colleagues in the current hot weather. But the very fact that I'm saying that, and there's no sort of overriding national understanding about those kind of health and safety issues, and no national representation for that, is one of the problems that archaeology has.
And on that note, I suppose what I would say, it's interesting that the notion of national action by archaeologists is inconceivable at this stage. You would think that we were like police in that sense, and yet we're not, and we're certainly not valued like police.
No, exactly. I often like to say that that archaeology is and certainly the planning archaeology is the emergency service for our past. It's the ambulance service that comes to the rescue when our past is threatened with destruction. But people value it. People turn up at festival events. They go to, as you said, stately homes and sites, and they walk the Offa's Dyke Path and Hadrian's Wall Walk and things like that. But there isn't the connect with the current workforce that there is with other areas of society, like nurses, like doctors, like teachers. Public services, because archaeology hasn't presented itself as a public service. It's presented itself as an adjunct to industry, as an adjunct to development. And
as a potentially optional one at that.
Absolutely. Push will really come to shove if the government, a Truss or a Sunak government, decides that it's going to water down environmental protection within planning, including the need to do archaeology.
And
then does the profession do, and who leads it?
Yes.
Who leads that action? Who pulls the profession together and puts out a platform? Who is the Mick Lynch of archaeology to go onto Newsnight? In question time. I can't think of anyone at the moment. Can you?
I can think of a couple of people who would like to think that they are.
That's different.
And by that, I do not mean us. I'm not at all interested in trying to represent archaeology. But I am interested in the health of the sector. And just one more thing I'd add to that. I mean, you said that people like to visit sites up and down the country, but also as well on a day-to-day basis. If there's an archaeological excavation happening at the end of the high street, people stop and have a look. People are interested, and so when you say we're the emergency service for our physical heritage, that's not to say that you should be pulling over to let archaeology vans pass in an emergency. When we're not a blue light service, so don't get us wrong on that. But we are not only necessary but also interesting and arguably crucial. Otherwise, stuff is lost, and stuff may well be lost if the second big chunk of this watching brief focus goes ahead. Elizabeth Truss, the second candidate to be the PM, still standing, has quote.
I think we have to say the polling's probably pretty inaccurate with a relatively small group of people in the first place, and also people who are voting in a private poll. But at the moment, Liz Truss is pretty much being tipped as a shoo-in. It's hers to lose.
Exactly. Yeah. So she's likely our next prime minister, and she has pledged to scrap planning red tape. This is a favourite phrase of the Tories and of the right, in so-called investment zones. Now, this also is not a new idea. I remember one of the very first issues that you and I ever covered together. This was before Watching Brief was a thing. This was when I was doing Archaeosoup no, Archaeosoup news, and we were doing the odd interview together. When in 2012, there was a coalition government that did a reassessment of the planning bill.
That's right.
Johnson,
The National Planning Policy Framework came out of it.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, the previous government under Johnson had a big idea that was eventually sort of somewhat shelved, that may be reheated. Is it oven ready? I don't know. It may be reheated. But anyway, Liz Truss has been quoted as saying, she is now the odds-on to beat Rishi Sunak to become Conservative leader. Said that the new zones are, quote, at the heart of my vision for levelling up. This is a continuation of a Boris Johnson policy, so-called levelling up the country. She said, "We will work." This is quote: "We will work with local communities to identify sites ripe for transformation across the country through lower taxes, reduced planning restrictions, and red tape. These zones would open up the floodgates to new waves of investment." Truss said the move will create new hubs for innovation and enterprise, end quotes. Now, so he also said, my investment zones will rejuvenate local areas in the same way London Docklands was regenerated with new jobs and industries for the future. This all sounds fantastic. It's a statement. If it's all definitely, absolutely going to happen and true, very interesting, possibly potentially very good for lots of people's jobs and job prospects. Two problems with that, though. First of all, there's no guarantee that tax cuts actually result in this, especially in an economy as we're facing potentially the worst recession since 2008, which was meant to be a once-in-a-century event. In so much as people who it would benefit are not the poorest in society. It would benefit people who are higher up, and there's no guarantee that money would make its way anywhere other than to their own bills, because everyone needs to be able to pay their bills, or is trying to be able to pay their bills. And the second thing as well is she's a bit light on detail here, but is she potentially talking about revisiting the definition of a brownfield site or a greenfield site, or what? Because so just for people at home or people outside the country, greenfield tends to be relatively untouched countryside around an urban environment, fields, forests, wetlands, this kind of thing. Brownfield, it can be repurposed, either former residential sites, maybe with houses that should be knocked down and potentially rebuilt, or industrial areas where factories potentially are left unused and that land can be repurposed. So is there any indication, do you think, of what exactly she means by these zones?
Well, there are indications, and they're quite concerning, I think. And it's not just Truss who is saying these things. Sunak has alluded to similar things, and in fact, one of his particular policy signatures is on something called free ports. He was rather unfortunately quoted as having invented the idea of free ports, at which point people jumped on him and said, actually, the idea of free ports were around sort of 400 BC with the Greeks. The idea of a place where you could import and export things without having to pay taxes. So it's a long-standing idea in developed economies that you create special zones where different rules apply. And ideally, for industrialists, for entrepreneurs, for people importing and exporting or storing, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
The overheads are lower. So combining Truss's development zones and Sunak's free ports, and I think we can talk about them together.
Well, because I think at least their ideas are likely to make it into the next cabinet. If not,
that's right.
If not, they're
certainly
going to be
so. The point I would make is they were there in the current cabinet too.
Yeah.
Or at least under the Johnson government. Johnson's first communities secretary, honest Robert Jenrick MP, was steering a bill through the House of Commons which would have created what's called zonal planning. So that, for example, there would be certain zones where there would be a presumption that planning permission would be granted and there would be minimal interventions before construction began.
Yes.
And so the idea that any sort of archaeological surveys and so on had to be done beforehand, before even the planning application went in. Otherwise, you wouldn't hold up a planning application for environmental assessments and so on and so on and so on. Other areas would remain protected or would have more stringent requirements for environmental impact assessments and so on. Now, that bill ran into problems in Parliament to the extent that in the end those ideas were dropped. And in fact, the bill was held up and held up and held up until it sort of it was like the Cheshire Cat. It disappeared into its own grin, or rather Bob Jenrick's grin, after meeting with a developer and being shown a promotional video and having his he and his deputy sign off on each other's town centre funding so that it looked as though they weren't actually rigging the system to benefit their own constituencies. But that's another story.
What was the objection? Was this NIMBYism?
The objection was, and again, what you have to remember here, and it's why Liz Truss has been making comments about she likes to see crops in fields, not solar panels. That southern, largely English, largely older population of voters wants to hear things about its way of life, its countryside, that won't frighten the horses, to coin a phrase. They don't want Berkeley Homes, Barratt Homes, other developers are available to build 3 and 4 bedroom executive houses on former grade 1 farmland because there's a big profit in it.
So do you
want any kind of build?
So do you mean literally don't frighten the horses in the fields, or do you mean don't frighten the horses, the people who live in and around the area that may see development?
Well, the one is indivisible from the other in certain parts of the south of England. I think the home counties and Hampshire and places like that, where there are where traditionally they weighed the Tory vote rather than count it. They're that safe. The Tories were absolutely spooked when Jenrick's bill was going through Parliament at the same time as the Cheshire and Amersham by-election, and the Liberal Democrats overturned a Tory majority that was heading towards, I think it was around 25, 30,000.
Yeah.
And the Liberal Democrats took the seat. At that point, Conservative backbenchers in similar seats panicked, and it would appear told the government, you cannot go ahead with this. Yeah. Otherwise, we will lose the next election and lose big in the south, and that will be unheard of. So that's one of the things that Truss or Sunak will be up against, trying to get this through Parliament. There will be an element of the Tory party that won't wear it.
And that's all well and good, fantastic, to know that. But coming back to our focus of archaeology, how can we not have to rely on Tory voters to protect the standards that not only provide us with jobs, but also actually ensure that there is actually a green and a heritage environment to be looked after and to be studied and to be protected?
Okay. The running on this is being made by organisations like Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, RSPB, and the other expert pressure groups. Archaeology is largely absented itself from this kind of discussion. Public discussion of policy and trying to put pressure on the government. And there are historic reasons for that. We've talked about them many times on this show. People will know I've got strong opinions about the quality of the political operations that archaeologists front, or try to front, and how the profession represents itself in public.
Well, for example, see recently talking about Stonehenge and the highway. No, sorry, the National Highways, and they said Highways England again. The National Highways video. Yeah.
Exactly. But stepping back and looking at it as a technical problem, this is going to come back again, because I'm looking at the government's bidding book document for free ports. Now, and I'll come on to what free ports might turn into in a minute, but the bidding document for free ports under section 3.6 planning says bidders, people bidding to run these free ports, as private concerns, not as parts of government, not as parts of local government, as private concerns, will be able to take advantage of the planning reforms set out in the consultation response related to permitted development right and simpler, here's the keywords, area-based planning, in particular local development orders. The government recognises the advantages that wider planning reform can bring to Freeport development. Therefore, as part of a longer-term planning programme of reform to England's planning system, the government is exploring potential to go further in these areas, as well as the potential to test ambitious planning proposals in Freeports, taking advantage of the controlled spaces they offer. In other words, they're going to experiment with changing the rules.
It's also
interesting.
interesting.
And that won't mean more archaeology.
No, it won't. It's also interesting use of language that recognise the benefits as opposed to the government insists on the benefits, if that means insists that they are real. Yeah. And
or recognises that effective planning, effective oversight of planning is important in protecting the environment that we all share.
Well, speaking of the environment we all share, didn't we figure out a couple of days ago that this has impact potentially for Dartmoor?
Right. This is where it gets interesting. Now, the idea of a free port, you imagine sort of somewhere like Tilbury or Dover. A defined area where ships interact with the land to get things put on them or taken off them. Right.
Yeah, like maybe maximum 10 miles square.
Yeah, so it's certainly probably somewhere within sight of the sea, shall we say?
Yeah.
In fact, a free port can be inland. One of the biggest, most important free ports in Europe is in Geneva.
Yes.
And it has been associated with mass, sort of industrial scale artifact laundering of looted heritage artifacts and the storage of art objects for tax reasons, which will.
Yay! Oh, goody!
But no, our reader can just Google Geneva Freeport artifact trafficking. You'll find the UNESCO reports and so on. But no, if you look at the government website, we've linked to it below the line. But the government website has maps of the proposed Freeport areas.
Yes.
And for example, the Freeport focused on Plymouth extends right up into Dartmoor, a national park, area of outstanding national beauty. Now, why would you want to...
And a Bronze Age landscape as well.
And a Bronze Age landscape. Yeah, exactly. One of the most important prehistoric landscapes in Britain. As much, if not more so, than the Stonehenge landscape in terms of what's there.
Also with connections all the way to places like Tel Aviv. People were trading in tin in the Bronze Age to the Middle East.
Right.
Anyway.
So why would you want to, within an area like that, for example, relax planning rules? And
it's the money.
Anyone listen to this on the podcast version? Marc has just been making a sort of filthy lucre gesture.
Yeah,
give me the money. Give me the money. But look, it's.
By the way, we have a Patreon. Sorry, no, go on.
The free port of watching brief. No, look. All these areas are significant, have significant history, have significant archaeology, have significant industrial heritage or whatever. Why would you want to relax rules there if it's not to make development easier and accountability less effective?
Yeah.
And just to finish, a number of people, particularly on the left now, are linking the idea of free ports and development areas with an idea for which is often called charter cities. And the ideas particularly of an economist from Stanford University called Paul Romer, who Rishi Sunak has name checked a number of times in his talking about his philosophy, really, his economic philosophy. Roma suggests that economic incentives drive innovation and technological change. And for that to work, you need a culture of enterprise. And the idea is that you create specific environments where enterprise can thrive. But the idea on the right is you do that by removing any kind of oversight.
Yeah.
Or strict rules around, for example, things like workers' rights, pay and conditions. And again, people on the left are linking this with the attack, suggestion that the government, for example, a Truss government might try, and a Sunak government, might try and remove the UK from the European Convention on Human Rights. Which again is very easy to say and very difficult to do. Apart from anything else, it would mean tearing up the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, which is founded on the European Court of Human Rights, amongst other things.
And also, as well, despite its name, we were authors of it. Like we
It was largely written by British lawyers after the Second World War to try and prevent something like the Nazi dictatorship and the Holocaust and genocide happening in Europe again.
Oh, God.
It's not about allowing somebody who's an asylum seeker to stay in this country because they have a cat. That is misinformation.
Yeah.
It's a very serious protection on your rights, my rights, everybody's rights. But the suggestion is that this whole culture of free ports that could move into the idea of charter cities which sit outside of normal national law is an aim of certainly the Truss axis of the Conservative Party leadership, possibly Sunak too.
Do you know, I suppose my final thought on that is it's interesting. This morning, in fact, I came across a news story of a 17-year-old who's invented a new electric motor that could revolutionize the electric car industry. And he hasn't done it to make money. He's been motivated by concerns about the environment, by personal intrigue into what's possible in engineering. This idea that it's just economic incentives and it's also driving down things, so-called impediments, things like human rights, that driving these things down is the best way to do things. That is an example of groupthink, I would argue. It's people who already believe that, telling each other that is the best way to proceed. And I'm not saying that can't be part of it. Reassessing how areas work, perhaps creating designated industrial zones and business-rich districts and ports where trade can happen more freely. But it's interesting as well, the flip side of that coin. Okay, if everyone is motivated by the ability to earn a crust and have high standards of income, pay archaeologists more. Do it. It's you can't have it both ways. You can't say we want a high wage, to quote Johnson, high wage, high skill economy, and tell highly educated people who are working as part of the process that leads to the building of these places that you say you think will drive the economy, and say, but we don't want to have to pay those skilled people what they're actually worth. You can't have it both ways. Or you can be moving towards a country that scraps human rights and attempts to more or less have a two-tier earning reality for people in the country.
Yeah. Look, as we're winding up, I think I'd say two other things just to round off what you were saying there. Yes. Archaeologists should be paid more. They should have been paid more 30 years ago.
Yeah.
There is a long-standing failure of leadership of the sector to stand up for its workforce. There's almost been it's almost been apologetic that if you let us onto the site to dig, we won't make trouble and we won't ask to be paid the same as other degree holding members of the development team, like the surveyors and
we're not an impediment. Honestly, we're not.
We're not an impediment. We're not red. No, we're really nice people, and we don't want to. Rather than being proud of the fact that we're there because we deserve to be there, because we're there on behalf of the communities that we serve. We often say that. Stand up for that.
Yeah.
That's the arguments that the doctors and the nurses and the police and the RMT use. And why should archaeologists be any different?
Yeah.
The other thing, though, and I'm returning really to this start of the discussion about Sunak and Truss and the Conservative Party leadership campaign, and that is a comment. There was an op-ed in the Spectator magazine, which is a writer centre magazine. It's a conservative-leaning magazine. Last week by a man called John Oxley, who wrote, "This weekend, Twitter was ablaze with shock when Rishi Sunak talked about cutting degrees that don't lead to good jobs. Many on the left took this as an attack on the university sector or even part of a grand plan to exclude the working classes from the humanities. In truth, it is neither. It is Sunak appealing to an electorate who came of age when 10% of the population went to university and economic growth carried them to prosperity, who now see their grandchildren laden with debt, unable to buy a home. It's the, quote, common sense of the bloke at the end of the Conservative club bar.
Yeah.
Nothing more than a trope. It's not something that will seriously ever happen." In other words, what we're seeing in the campaign is performance art to get either Sunak or Truss elected. It then, whichever of them gets the job, it then they then have a head-on crash with the reality of people's heating bills going from under £1,000 to £3,000 in a few months. And that is not something that can be dealt with by creating a free port.
No, I agree. Although it's fair to say, even if it is performance art, it's performance art that they keep on coming back to, and it's playing with real people's lives.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, the tropes like the cultural, again, we haven't had time to talk about it this week, but the Times came out with a front page story based on a fishing expedition about texts that have been cancelled when out of 140 universities, they managed to find 3 texts that haven't even been banned. They've been substituted for others in reading lists.
Yeah, so they're still available in the library. They're just better books available.
It was a complete non-story, and in any normal time, in any newspaper without an agenda, that story would have been spiked as what okay, you set out with a thesis, couldn't prove it, move on.
Yeah,
But they ran it on the front page. Included and they included personal attacks on academics. It's it's all part of the performance art of the right at the moment of the debate, and certainly of the current Conservative Party.
And as you say, the question is who's gonna actually push back against this, actually do something. Where's that coming from? Well, so go on.
We will return to this when somebody gets appointed and we see who their cabinet is.
Yeah, well, yes, when we see who's actually in charge of culture, etc. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, you mean? Oh, come on! Surely you can't think that somebody as brilliant as Nadine Dorries is going to get sacked. I mean, the culture minister who has created probably more headlines than any other culture minister in our history.
Yeah, and about whom I gather we'll be talking, not in the not too distant future.
Maybe.
Oh man. Okay. Well, thank you as ever, Andy, for your time this week. It's been a pleasure. Thank you guys at home for watching, for listening, for commenting below. As ever, if you have any stories that you want us to cover, to examine, to look at, please do get in touch. There's an email on screen. Our DMs are open. And I think this counts as a silly season story, doesn't it? In so much as there's nothing. This is indirectly archaeological, but this has very much been a week where actually they are talking about exactly our little portion of the cultural economic zone. It's just whether or not archaeologists are actually aware of it or not. So we figured we'd just have a chat about that this week.
Look, archaeologists are part of communities. They have political views. They're part of all these arguments outside of just being archaeologists. An archaeologist is forever, not just for Christmas or not just for
And with that in mind, we have a Patreon. I know. I'm getting less and less bothered about just reminding people of that. It is, and will continue to be helpful and necessary, especially at the moment. Anyway, you take care, Andy. Thank you for watching, guys. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.